Turning Point. =RK equals. Part 5. Crate Company, Alpha Site, Ryloth. That stung. If it wasn't for my helmet, her armored fist could have easily broken my jaw. That gives a brand new meaning to the term battle, whistled Boyle. I glanced his way and then to where my hand was a moment ago. I cringed. I knew I could claim that placing my palm over her heart made healing her a bit more efficient power-wise, which was even true, but no one would believe me. Besides, that never passed through my mind while I was patching up our resident Mandalorian. I could hear Boyle whispering something to his buddy and a couple of clones started snickering. "Waxer," I snapped. "It will be a pleasure, sir," said the man, with a bit too much relish for his friend's comfort. "Waxer? No, wait a minute." Boyle walked backwards in an attempt to get away from his fellow soldiers, which led him straight to Captain Cat, who was talking with Numa and ignoring our antics. The glare the officer gave him was obvious despite his helmet. Cat slapped Boyle on the back of the head. The captain barked, making his displeasure evident to us all. "Boyle, stop acting like a criffing joker. You are a soldier of the Republic. Act like it." If it wasn't for a warning which came through the Force, Bo-Katan would have blindsided me with her next punch. Instead, I grabbed her armored fist centimeters from my face. "Our spar is over, Kryz," I snapped. She chuckled in answer. "I would say that the Jedi haven't fallen as much as we believed, but you aren't one of them. Are you?" she asked. There was a hint of mischief in her tone. "Me? A Jedi? That's a good joke." I smirked. Now, I believed that there was a point for your brazen entrance. "What do you want?" She stretched and moaned. The newly healed flesh was screaming in protest. It was something with which I was intimately familiar with. Good thing that I could use the Force to dampen any pain in my body. Wat Tambor, the local Confederation leader, is losing control of the situation. He even gave up control over a significant portion of the droid forces deployed away from the capital to Hutt mercenaries. She grumbled. As a sign that the Sis are willing to honor their deal, she sneered. "Is that how you apparently have some authority over this mess?" I asked and pointed to the still smoking remains of the beasts. Kryz shrugged. "It felt like a good idea at the time. However, I'm not in overall command of the droids stationed here. There is a tactical droid who does the job. I was sent merely as an advisor." She grumbled. My men gave her dirty looks, and a few of them started muttering before a glare of cat silenced them. Can't blame them. I wasn't thrilled either from the attack of those unwilling kamikazes. At least my men got out of it unscratched, which in combination with my little spar with the woman, did a lot to make cooperation with her acceptable, without really hurting the morale. They were trained by Mandalorian mercenaries themselves, so each one of my troopers was aware of at least the basics of the Mando culture. "You still haven't answered my question, Bo-Katan. What do you want?" "Tambor dead. And preferably to get of this rock in one piece. I can guarantee the first. We may have some issues with the second." She stiffened for a brief second. Only my Force-enhanced senses allowed me to perceive it. Kryz was ready to attack me if the situation warranted it. "Your presence here, no matter the official reason, paints you and the Death Watch as accomplices of all the atrocities committed by the Sis on Ryloth. The fact that your organization is little more than a bunch of common terrorists, who now will be seen as slavers to Booth, doesn't help you," I stated. She bristled hearing my accusation. "That's a lie. We are true Mandalorians, not a bunch of common criminals. All we want is to return our people to their senses. We are not a bunch of pacifistic cowards." "So you want to turn back the Mandalorian people back to their warrior roots? Commendable." I gave her a respectful nod, which took her off guard. "That's an unexpected sentiment from a Republic general," she whispered. "However, the Death Watch is doing it the wrong way. All that you'll achieve by acting as common terrorists is to antagonize your own people. Those cowards are not our people. We are warriors through and through." Bo-Katan snapped at me. "Perhaps. Yet you need them if you want to amount to anything but a single rogue clan. You need to win their hearts and minds, something that won't happen thanks to acts of petty terrorism." I smiled under my helmet. "You need to give a cause to the average new Mandalorian. A reason to put away his pacifism and embrace their true nature." Kryz stared at me thinking furiously. "You have a plan, I take it?" she asked. Many in fact. I nodded in the direction of the Sis artillery. Tambor and his ilk, with their actions of Ryloth, gave us unbeatable propaganda victory. In days, the entire galaxy will know what to expect if the Sis win. What happens on this world can, if presented properly, turn your peace-loving new Mandalorians into bloodthirsty warriors of legend, ready to tear the Confederacy apart. She shook her head in denial. It's unlikely. My sister and her lapdog abhor violence and war. Then persuade them otherwise. I challenged her. Once it is clear that Death Watch members were on Ryloth, aiding the Sis, they'll have no chance of swaying the masses on Mandalore. And that is if you are lucky. It was left unsaid that if they supported the criffing Confed bastards, there would be hell to pay. Once the true extent of the Sis depravities on Ryloth became known across the galaxy, the war was going to become really ugly. Bo-Katan glared at me. I could sense her mood. At the moment her emotions were shifting like an interceptor trying to evade multiple enemy fighters. Kryz and the Death Watch were now in a trap unwittingly made by whoever sent them here, and I was pretty sure that was done by their leader. Even a rumor of her organization's involvement with the events here would deal a deadly blow to their credibility. Even worse, from her point of view, was that she was that proof. I could feel how the realization was dawning on her. After nearly a minute of silence she shook her head sadly. Even if we manage to pull off a coup d'état, it will be for naught. Unless we do it with full support of the Sis. She grumbled. In such a case, there will be a hell to pay. I added. My smile turned into a grin. I had the best weapon to use against a Mandalorian. I had just scored a great victory in space, despite the severe mauling my forces had taken in the process. Even better, I had challenged her in single combat and won. You'll have a choice to make, Bo-Katan Kryz, I declared. You can help your misguided people open their eyes and become what they were meant to be, true Mandalorians. Honorable warriors, who could be the envy of the galaxy. I lowered my voice. Or will you try to turn them into a bunch of barbarians like the most of the Death Watch? What do you know about what it means to be a true Mandalorian? She scoffed. You'd be surprised. I muttered quietly. You have some time to make your decision, I said aloud. Aren't you the generous one? When I can afford to be. I ignored her sarcasm. You are pretending to be a common mercenary. It's time to act as one, I waved at her. Congratulations. You are hired to assist us in liberating Ryloth. =RK=. Bo-Katan shook her head in exasperation. That man was trying his best to push all her buttons. And almost succeeding. Even worse, he actually beat her in single combat. Her, Bo-Katan, the second in command of the Death Watch. His gall at outright saying that her organization was nothing more than a bunch of common criminals didn't sting her pride that much. She was defeated by a non-Mandalorian. She glared at him. And it was getting worse. Of course it did. There was a small, treacherous part of her mind that agreed with his logic. That was even worse. Bo-Katan glowered at the man, wondering what she was going to do. =RK. Sis positions, Alpha Site, Ryloth. Cat was not thrilled with his general's newest harebrained scheme. The only thing preventing him from complaining was the fact that Vale's ideas tended to work. So far, 2/3 of his company, the damn mercenary and the captain, were about to execute an attack as a diversion. They were to try sucking as many of the droids out as possible, so the general could hit the artillery with less resistance. They were taking positions in the canyon leading to the inner part of the village, where the hostages and heavy guns were located. Cat waited until the countdown, displayed on his helmet's visor, hit 0 and nodded at Boyle, who was armed with his missile launcher. The rest of the clones toting such weapons were further back, out of sight from their enemies, and took their lead from him and readied their own weapons. A single missile flew from the clone line and impaled a Sis tank. Its armor was found lacking and the machine slumped to its right, sending a fountain of smoke and fire into the air. This acted as a signal, causing the clones to send a torrent of blaster fire at the droids. Many of the machines were scythed down before the tanks returned the favor. Their cannons and secondary armaments roared in defiance, sending streams of scarlet death at the clones. This first barrage saw 8 of Cat's men obliterated. He bit of a curse and continued to lay down blaster fire, shoulder to shoulder with his men. He had to make it look believable. =RK=. Ghost Company, Gamma Site, Ryloth. Obi-Wan and Cody looked at each other. They were standing over the destroyed chassis of a super battle droid. One that had been modified with a missile launcher in its left arm. "That might work, General." 20-odd minutes later, Kenobi led the survivors of his company into attacking the final SIS defensive perimeter. They had 7 salvaged missile launchers with 19 reloads spread amongst them. 2 tall buildings, which were remade into strong points by the droids, were turned into rubble by a pair of warheads each. That opened the way for the clones by silencing the heavy repeater blasters placed in the dwelling's upper floors. Obi-Wan led the charge, using his lightsaber to deflect the blaster bolts coming his way. By making himself the primary target, he allowed more of his men to live. The troopers in turn did their best to eliminate the droids shooting at them and their general. As per the plan, Cody ordered 2 squads to secure each flank and slow down the droids converging on the site where the GAR had just penetrated their lines. The captain led the rest of his men after Obi-Wan, straight towards the artillery position, which was just behind a low row of lightly defended buildings. 3 more missiles shattered most of the resistance in their front, allowing Kenobi to lead an understrength platoon to the proton cannons. Behind them, the rear guard were fighting for their lives in a desperate attempt to hold the attention of the SIS droids protecting the perimeter. For them, the next few minutes were an orgy of death and destruction. Needles of azure and crimson-colored energy crisscrossed in the air, leaving ruins everywhere they hit. Soon the broken bodies of men and machines littered the ground. Cody signaled most of his men to spread out throughout the buildings and start clearing the droids, while the clones carrying the remaining missile launchers went after the cannons. In front of them, Kenobi burst in the small plaza, where the artillery was located. He charged amidst the squads of B-1s acting as a last-ditch defense, thus concentrating their attention on himself. It worked. Mostly. One of the B-1s, which was operating a proton cannon, was not fooled like his brethren and turned his weapon at the cluster of buildings being cleared by the clones. It sent a snapshot at a wall behind which a squad of Republic troopers were advancing. The only reason Cody and the rest of his men survived was that the smart fuse of the shell decided that it was too close to the gun which fired it to detonate at anything more than a fraction of its potential yield. The explosion only ended the lives of 5 clones, knocked 4 more out and despite the sound dampeners on their armors, deafened 5 more. Yet, that was too little too late. Cody's men who had salvaged missile launchers had shot a moment earlier. The armor of the proton cannons, which were protecting them from light weapons and shrapnel, proved woefully inadequate against missiles. Besides, each warhead was aimed at the open fire control station of the mobile artillery emplacements. 4 of the 5 guns fell to the ground as neutered wrecks. The only one that had no missile aimed at remained in SIS control for a couple of seconds longer, before the B-1 operating it was struck by a blaster bolt which Kenobi had deflected its way. The Jedi and his still battle-ready troopers made a short work of the few remaining droids trying to protect the artillery emplacements. Cody, who had been dazed by the artillery shell that wiped out one of his squads, came back to the real world. He winced. His head was ringing something awful. The captain stared through a nearby window and saw that the proton cannons were neutralized. The general and 2 of his men were busy releasing the locals and pointing them at the guns of the destroyed droids. Right. They were still in danger. Cody accessed the comm suite of his armor and smiled grimly. The jamming in the surrounding area was almost gone. His comm could easily burn through what little enemy ECM was bleeding from nearby areas. This is Ghost Actual. Gamma is condition green. I repeat, Gamma is condition green. The cannons are neutralized. He took a deep breath before shouting in the receiver. We need immediate air support. I repeat, we need immediate air support at my coordinates. Roger, Ghost Actual. We are lifting now. ETA, 2 minutes. Cody, who was nearly deaf, was unable to hear the cool answer of Razor 1, the leader of the gunship wing which brought them down to Ryloth. Hey equals. Kenobi had released 24 locals, before he felt that he was running out of time. Release the others and grab a gun. There are a lot of droids which are about to hit us any moment. We need your help to hold them off until reinforcements arrive. Obi-Wan ordered the elderly woman who appeared to be the village leader. She nodded and repeated his words on her native tongue. Most of the released locals, who were the men and women Kenobi felt would be best for helping him and his men in stopping the inevitable droid counterattack, were hastily arming themselves. Only 2, who were armed with vibroblades given to them by the clones, continued to cut free their fellow prisoners. The Jedi glanced at the Soul's still operational cannon and shook his head. It was useless right now. They had to stop the droids before the machines reached the buildings surrounding the artillery site. Anything less would leave few hundreds of bound locals in the crossfire. He rushed towards the place he felt Cody's presence. Moments later, Kenobi found the commander. The clone was shouting in his comm for rare support. Good. With the local guns silenced, the Larts should be able to help dispatching the remaining droids. Cody, what's the ETA of the air support? Asked Obi-Wan, but his subordinate didn't even notice him. It took Kenobi patting the clone on the shoulder, before Cody paid him any attention. Sorry, sir. I didn't hear you, screamed the commander. No need to be so loud, quipped Obi-Wan. He glanced at the devastated interior of the building and frowned. Can't hear you, sir, shouted Cody. The Jedi shook his head. He only hoped that his friend wasn't permanently deaf. Kenobi patted Cody on the shoulder and pointed him in the direction of the droids who had mostly mopped up the squads left to slow them down. The clone officer nodded, and took position behind a half-demolished wall. They were being joined by more and more locals, who had armed themselves with weapons taken from destroyed droids. One of the clones, a corporal who Kenobi didn't know, looked at the volunteers and muttered, "Great. We might even make it." "We will make it, soldier," the general said loudly, in an attempt to reassure both the clone troopers who were not deafened and the locals. Heartbeats later, the droids which were still active, disregarded the couple of survivors from the rearguard and charged the rest of Kenobi's force. They were met with withering amount of blaster fire. However, most of the shots snapped by the locals missed by miles. The B-1 droids were falling down in droves as the cannon fodder they were, but in doing so, those machines were soaking up fire which was not hitting their more dangerous brethren. The B-2 super battle droids were the ones retaliating effectively to the fire of the flimsy line of clones and armed civilians. The walking wall of steel was coming closer and closer, paying with 4 of their mechanical lives for every one of the defenders they were claiming. It was an exchange rate that the Cis troops could afford to pay. Even the sole survivor of the rear guard, who was sending blue needles of concentrated energy at the backs of the advancing machines, did little to dissuade the machines from wiping out Kenobi, his men and the locals helping them. The droids were mere 3 meters from the Republic remnants, when the air vibrated with the familiar droning of Lart gunships. Some of the robots turned around, started scanning the air for the perceived threat. It did them little good besides being able to see the craft which ended their existence. A whole wing of heavily armed Larts flew centimeters over the roofs of the villagers' dwellings. The predatory forms of the gunships dashed over the advancing droids. They unleashed missiles and rockets, blowing up the droids farthest from Cody's position. Thin darts of laser fire came to life from the small ball turrets mounted at the noses of the Larts, neatly slicing the droids into pieces. Kenobi released a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The force-be-damned machines were caught in the open and demolished in short order. The sight of droids being turned into scrap didn't make him feel any better. Most of his men were gone or mercifully only wounded. Dozens of the locals had perished in the last, desperate firefight. Despite all that, they had won. The artillery at this position was neutralized, and hopefully Anakin and Del-Qatar had also taken their objectives, or would do so soon. Obi-Wan looked to his right. There was a girl, no more than 15 years old, laying slumped on her side. Her empty purple eyes were looking straight at the Jedi. Kenobi closed his eyes, calling on the light side of the Force once more. He felt its rejuvenating touch and concentrated on it, releasing the bitterness he was feeling, as well as the first wisp of anger aimed at the Cis leader who had decided to use the locals as live shields. To Obi-Wan, the so-called success of taking down the guns tasted as bitter as defeat. Turning point. =RK=. Part 6. Crate Company, Alpha Site, Ryloth. Cat had lost 22 men, dead and wounded before calling in the retreat. Most of them were taken out by the damn tanks. The captain glanced behind his back once he had slid behind a new cover. Half a dozen tanks were moving in pursuit, followed by 2 companies of super battle droids. Behind those, 4 more tanks, the last that was supposed to be in the region, as well as more droids are moving into defensive positions in the choke point. So far everything was going according to the plan. If the damn woman kept her part of the deal with the general, that is. A loud roar reverberated through the canyon, almost deafening Cat. An overpressure wave slammed at the rock he was using as cover, shaking it. He glanced over it and smiled. The tanks, while unharmed from the blast wave, were moved out of their precise formation. Most of the droids were on the ground, thrown off their feet. So she came through. "Fire at will," ordered Cat and followed his own order. A moment passed before 8 missiles streaked at the 6 Cis tanks which were pursuing the clones and the machine's infantry support. The warheads slammed into the Cis armor, blasting through the tough composite. Once the tank's defenses were breached, the inside of the machines were engulfed into a hellish storm of plasma, molten metal, and shrapnel. In 2 cases, something truly critical was damaged, and the machines blew up, sending their turrets sailing through the air. The rest of the tanks died less spectacular deaths, but were nonetheless left laying on the ground as expensive sculptures of modern art. =RK=. Bo-Katan was almost impressed by the clones' tenacity. They had kept up their mock attack until nearly a sixth of their company's total numbers were down, then executed a flawless fighting retreat, taking their fallen with them. Only to lead their pursuers into an ambush, which Chris sprung when she blew up the charges planted by the Cis at the choke point. By that single action alone, she buried a third of the droids protecting the proton cannons, as well as their remaining tanks. The blast wave sent a lot of the machines into disarray, something she took advantage of. The Mandalorian warrior activated her rocket pack and jumped from behind the boulder behind which she took cover. She strafed a mauled platoon of super battle droids, raining blaster fire and missiles at the machines. Only on her third pass any of their counterfire came anywhere close to her, and by that time only 3 B-2s were still relatively intact. On her last pass one of them even managed to hit her, but its shot splashed over her Mandalorian steel-forged armor, melting off some of the tough alloy but leaving her unharmed. There was nothing left standing to warrant a 5th pass. =RK=. I led my chosen strike team through the sewers, with Numa trailing off at the back of the column with Waxer and Boyle. According to Bo-Katan, there were at least few remaining scout droids hunting for stragglers through the village. All of them armed, so I decided that the kid was safer with us as long as she stayed underground while we dealt with the robots. When we were at the exit leading to the plaza with the cannons and the hostages, I stopped for a brief moment. I drew the Force to me, drinking deeply from it. Pale ionic energy danced around my left hand, ready to be unleashed. "Check your targets, we have civvies spread amongst the clankers. Cover each other and don't get killed. That's an order." A round of brief chuckles answered me. I levitated the hatch barring our way. It turned out to be well oiled and opened without a sound. I exited first, with my sword at the ready, but inactive. There was a droid in front of me, with its back turned towards me. It was busy clearing up a nearby cage, probably where the now filleted animals were being kept. I sent the energy engulfing my arm at it, which struck it soundlessly. The droid froze, giving off a soft buzz/hiss sound and fell like a puppet with its strings cut. I caught it with the Force, gently placing it on the dirty floor, so it won't clatter. Behind me, my men were quietly exiting and taking positions near the walls of the tunnel. We were in time. There were 27 seconds before the agreed attack time. Cat would be executing his part of the plan any minute now. I waited patiently until the counter reached 0, despite the battle lust racing through my veins, feeding off the dark side energies I was using to empower myself. An explosion sounded not too far away. I could sense a lot of droids heading that way. I waited while my men attacked the Cis forces as a diversion. I waited as they fought and died, sensing each one of them passing away. 14 of my soldiers died to give us an opening to destroy our targets and save the locals. Explosions, strong enough to shake the ground, echoed overhead and darted forward. A Force-enhanced leap led me in the middle of the plaza, where I landed feet first over the torso of a B-1. The flimsy machine's torso caved under my weight and momentum, wrecking it. The one which was next to it was bisected by my blade, while I sent an energy bolt resembling a thin, pale bolt of lightning at one of the robots controlling a proton cannon. That machine died with its internal components slagged. I was on the move, not stopping for more than a moment in order to send an ionic bolt at an artillery droid. My men surged from the tunnel, taking aimed shots at any droid that was moving. 2 of them were carrying missile launchers. The troopers turned their weapons on the enemy cannons, which were trying to reorient themselves and target us. Their armor caved in when hit by warhead designed to take out dedicated tanks, leaving only 2 operational cannons. "Take out the left," I shouted in order to my troopers, and ran straight at the one to the right. Its gun was almost pointing at me. If it shot now, I was likely a goner as well as a lot of civvies. I threw my lightsaber at an annoying super battle droid which flew backwards, impaled with my blade. The force surged through me as I commanded and molded it to my will. My arms were covered by a ghostly sheer of energy which became concentrated enough to blur their outlines. I used this energy to grab the artillery emplacement that was my target and pick it up. I wrenched it upward. The gun barrel tore from its chassis split second after sending a proton shell at the heavens. I left the 2 pieces fall to the ground and they smashed 2 super battle droids which were shooting at me. Crimson blaster bolts scorched the chest plate of my armor, its composite leaking in half-molten streams down my torso. I winced at the heat which fought with the environmental controls of my armor in an attempt to sear my flesh. I felt stinging sensation over my chest before the armor managed to regulate the internal temperature and cool down to acceptable levels. The ancient piece of equipment saved my life once again, but was mostly ruined. I hoped that I'd be able to patch it up to an acceptable condition before I entered in my next battle. Replacing my armor with something giving me equivalent protection would be possible only when the first variants of light power armor were operational in few months. At least the exoskeletons would be ready for combat testing earlier. A stray shot which passed too close for comfort brought me back to the present. Damn it all. I had spaced out in the middle of combat. A great way to get oneself killed. I rolled under a long burst sent my way by a SB droid and fried it with an ionic bolt, before summoning my sword. The plaza was battered by a blast wave as 2 missiles blew up the last proton cannon, before it could bear on any of us. After that, moping up the few still active droids which were nearby was easy. LT. Get a couple of squads to start releasing the hostages. 2 more squads with me. We are going to hunt down the remaining droids. The rest of you establish a perimeter and secure it, I ordered. Before we headed for the pass, to deal with the enemy stragglers, I checked the casualties. 5 of my men were hit during the melee. Only 2 of them would recover. 18 Twi'lek were wounded. 10 died before the acclimators landed and we could provide them with adequate medical assistance. 4 of them were children. =RK=. Bo-Katan flew through the canyon, towards the artillery position. On her way she strafed few droids, most of which were the almost harmless and useless B-1s. Half a click from the plaza, she found a single tank driving away from the rock slide she had caused. Chris grinned when she recognized the droid whose upper body could be seen from the open commander's hatch. It was the tactical one responsible for the defense of this village. That sick clanker had been irritating her since the moment she met it. She dived towards the ground and released her single remaining heavy missile. It struck the tank in the lesser rear armor, punching through like a heavy turbo laser through defenseless freighter. Bo-Katan must have hit something vital, because the armored vehicle erupted in an impressive pyrotechnic conflagration, which sent the half-melted and shredded upper torso of the tactical droid high in the air. The woman chuckled and sent few blaster bolts at the failing piece of scrap. It was demolished even further and pieces of it rained all over the canyon. Soon after that, Bo-Katan met Vale, who was leading 10 men against the last remaining droids. He was deflecting the machine's shots and frying them with wide arches of lightning emanating from his left hand. No one seeing him at that moment could mistake him for a Jedi. He fought with ferocity that could be envied by many a Mandalorian. She licked her lips and smiled like a predator who had just scented its next meal. Down below, the general stopped his progress and stared straight at her. Bo-Katan smirked. She was going to have so much fun with that clueless man. =RK=. Torrent Company, Beta Site, Ryloth. Rex ducked under a missile launched by a B-2 droid, which was soon taken down by burst of blaster fire sent its way from 3 clones. One of those men was cut to pieces by the concentrated fire from no less than 15 machines. The captain threw his last grenade at a pair of super battle droids which had missile launchers and were preparing to use them. The energy blast fried the circuits of the machines as they tried to fire their weapons. One warhead blew up in the barrel of its launcher, making the robot attached to it into so much steel fillings. The other was marginally luckier. Its missile launched clearly and promptly struck a nearby building, tearing up its facade. 3 more droids were taken out with well-aimed burst of fire, then another trooper fell after being hit in the head. An iron grenade dropped a quartet of B-2s which were bunched close to each other. For first time in his life, Rex felt totally helpless. He had committed his reserves, his men were pinned down and encircled, with no room to maneuver, while the enemy was picking them one by one. The captain emptied the last few shots remaining in the power cell of his left-hand pistol, demolishing a particularly troublesome super battle droid, and went behind the low wall he used for cover to reload. He was racking his brain for anything that could permit him to save at least few of his brothers, but there was nothing he could think of. Even worse, he had lost contact with the Jedi, and any attempt to raise them was met with static. Another clone died, the cover he was kneeling behind was demolished by a missile, and the blast wave hurled the man's body was hurled into a nearby wall. Rex opened fire at the machine that just killed one of his soldiers and didn't go back under cover before the damn thing was down. The captain blinked in confusion. He was feeling hot, very hot. Rex looked down and stared at the smoking ruin, which was the piece of his armor that was supposed to cover his gut. That explained it. At least he didn't feel pain. Which was not supposed to be a good thing, right? He grunted and shot off the head of a B-1 which was trying to advance despite the fierce resistance of his men. Crithing clankers. =RK=. Anakin was standing in front of his wounded apprentice, who was leaning on the wall behind them and using her lightsaber to deflect the shots coming from the advancing droids. "I'm sorry, Snips. I criffed up," he muttered. "We can't win them all, Master," she chuckled with dark humor. "You should get away while you still can, Sky Guy," she added in a somber tone. Anakin smiled sadly and shook his head. If he ran, and abandoned Ahsoka as well as Rex and rest of his men, he had a chance to make it out. Small, but it was there. He glanced Ahsoka's way and gave her a reassuring smile, which both of them knew for the lie it was. Their only chance for survival was an immediate airstrike at the proton cannons, followed by a wing of Larts taking apart the droids before the clankers could blast them to pieces. But even if the gunships left in that precise minute, they would be too late. The Larts that brought them down, which were the closest Republic assets, were 3 minutes away. In less than a half of that time the droids would have his position demolished and overran. Anger aimed at his own self, at his overconfidence and the arrogant way he had carried out this mission raged within Skywalker. He knew it in his heart. It was his own mistakes that got them all killed. While he could sense about a third of Torrent Company still fighting, the clones under Rex's command were blinking one after another from Anakin's perception. Even the captain was slowly becoming less bright to his senses. Rex was wounded. Badly. Another clone died. A man he was responsible for. Anakin shouted in anger and frustration. He gave voice to all his bottled feelings, his anguish and failure. Skywalker's scream reverberated through the Force, resonating with dark power. The half-demolished wall through which he had brought Ahsoka in their short-lived readout was shattered to grain-size pieces as a visible ripple passed through the air. It continued after smashing the stone and released its power outside, tearing apart the droids in its path. Anakin panted, gasping for air. At least 100 droids lied in pieces. He stared at the devastation he had somehow wrought before he was brought back by Ahsoka shouting, "Sky Guy. This is your chance. Run." Skywalker glanced at his apprentice for a moment, uncomprehending. She gazed back, straight at his yellow-tinted eyes. He shook his head, grabbed her and used the Force to blast open a hole in the wall at the back, while no one was shooting at him. Anakin disregarded Ahsoka's protests and dragged her deeper in the building. "Skywalker. What the hell are you doing? Why can I hear you even over here?" Anakin was startled as Del-Qatar's voice sounded in his head. He glanced at Ahsoka, who looked back with her huge eyes. "Did you hear that, too?" he wondered aloud. The Padawan nodded her head and winced as her wounded leg hit an upturned table. Her attempts to suppress the pain through the Force weren't working as well as she hoped. "We are in deep banter shit," Skywalker thought aloud. "That we are," mentally answered Ahsoka. "Explain. Now," snapped Vale, through the bond he shared with Skywalker's Padawan. Her eyes widened. She was connected through the Force with both men, and Del-Qatar was using her like some sort of conduit to speak with her and her master. "We are in trouble, Del-Qatar. Master lost his prosthetic arm, I'm wounded, and Rex and Torrent Company are getting cut to pieces. We won't last much longer. RK equals. Crate Company location, Alpha Site, Ryloth. I closed my eyes and frowned. If Ahsoka's and Anakin's situation was as bad as I felt thanks to my strange bond with the kid, then I had no planet-bound asset that could make it to their position in time. Fighters or bombers from orbit wouldn't cut it either. I felt that they had only few minutes. At best. An orbital strike would wipe them out. They were too close for such a thing. The spaceship's weapons were too powerful for danger-close strikes. Or were they? Ion cannons. But those that could effectively hit ground targets from orbit were the heavy guns on the Venatas. At least a couple of those were still operational, but even at low power they had very high chance of frying unprotected people on the ground. It was the reason why I didn't use them to take out the cannons and had to proceed with the ground attacks. I ran to a nearby trooper who was carrying a lasercom system. It was a foolproof way to connect with our orbital assets despite the enemy ECM, which was deaf to long-range comms. Despite having dealt with the droids in our immediate vicinity, there was at least one ECM emitter hidden nearby which was keeping us in the dark, so to speak. It took one long minute, in which I could feel echoes through my connection with Ahsoka. Anakin's soldiers were dying. "Sir, I've got the Admiral on the line." I grabbed the comm set from my man. "Admiral, Yularen. I need immediate ion cannon strike in the vicinity of Site Beta. Minimum safe distance and power. Skywalker's being overrun as we speak." I ordered and snapped the long string of my identification code for the day. "Immediately, sir," he answered crisply. RK equals. Republic Fleet, high orbit over Ryloth. It took nearly another minute for the frantic orders to pass through the chain of command. The Victory had to rotate so her sole surviving ion cannon could bear on the surface, while targeting solutions were crunched by her computers. Then she fired, sending columns of ion energy at a certain spot on the plain below. They struck 1.2 kilometers behind the proton cannons which were Skywalker's target. That was about 2.5 clicks from where Torrent Company and the Jedi were making their last stand. The ion energy, which is so deadly for any machine, usually had mild effects on organic life. A pulse of a grenade could give a light shock, perhaps cause mild burns. The main cannons of the Venatas were of entirely different league. And while they could dial up and down their power, those weapons were never meant to be fired where unshielded beings could be hit. A tsunami of ion energy washed over the village. The power surged around and through the buildings, often discharging itself in the form of lightning bolts. Droids burnt and melted. Some even exploded. The artillery park was engulfed by an ion storm which shattered the cannons and some of their shells, wiping out everything in the plaza and hundreds of meters around. The Jedi and the remnants of Torrent Company were lucky. The blast wave was stopped by the buildings of the village short of them. Those same dwellings did nothing to even slow down the energy surges, powerful enough to fry an adult humanoid with a single strike. Both clones and droids were electrocuted by torrents of power. Nearby, in a half-demolished building, Anakin sensed a warning screamed at him through the Force. He tossed Ahsoka in nearby corner and jumped over her, covering his apprentice with his body. Skywalker raised over them the most powerful anti-radiation shield he could and prayed to the Force that it would be enough. Bolts of ion energy arched through the house and struck Anakin's barrier. Skywalker felt as if his entire body was on fire and he screamed hoarsely until he blacked out. Ryloth, Endgame. RK equals. Part 1. RK equals. Med Bay, Assault Ship Courageous, Republic LZ, Ryloth. I was watching as doctors and med droids were working on Anakin. They were cutting charred pieces of cloth and armor off of him. In the room to the right, Ahsoka was being treated for her blaster wounds. Thanks to Skywalker, who had mostly shielded her with his body and Force powers, she was only mildly singed. If she had been wearing an armor, she might have gotten away only with mild injuries. That was something we were going to talk about, once the docs were finished with her. Next to me, Kenobi was staring with empty eyes at his former apprentice, who was covered with first and second-degree burns. When all was said and done, Anakin got lucky. Oh, he'll have some impressive scarring across his chest and would need to wear a respirator mask for the next few weeks, but he was expected to make full recovery. So would Captain Rex, who would be out of commission for a month or so. However, with the exception of 4 grievously wounded troopers, Torrent Company was gone. Kenobi's men had fared a bit better, A small platoon could be assembled from the survivors of Ghost Company. Once they all are back on duty, which would take months and artificial limbs for some of them. All in all, the assault on the artillery positions had turned out to be almost as big a clusterfuck as the space battle. I could scarcely believe it. What in the name of the Force possessed the Jedi to go into battle with only blaster carbines and ion grenades? General Kenobi. Walk with me, I said in a tone leaving no room for mistaking my words as anything but orders, and headed to the nearest conference room, where we could speak without someone interrupting us. His head turned slowly my way and he stared at me for a few seconds before shaking his head and following me. When we were both inside, I manipulated the door panel with the Force, making sure that we wouldn't be disturbed. General Kenobi, I'll read your and Skywalker's R's when you are able to finish the damn things. Right now I want to know, what the hell were you two idiots thinking? You went in carrying only light weapons, I shouted at him, which tore him out of his funk. Obi-Wan winced and lowered his head. 2 companies of the finest men the Republic had, all but destroyed. Tell me, General Kenobi, what were you thinking when you ordered your men to carry only carbines and iron grenades against a numerous well-entrenched enemy? Now that I had his undivided attention, I spoke quietly. No need to shout anymore. We came here to liberate the people of Ryloth, not to demolish their homes, he mumbled. Let me get this straight. You were armed for a peacekeeping action, despite being aware that the Sis would be dug in deep to protect the proton cannons. All because you wanted to keep a few damn buildings safe? I was incredulous. It's the Jedi way. Causing wanton destruction, especially on a Republic world. I glared at him and pointed at his apparel. From the moment you put on that uniform, General, you have been a Guard General first and a Jedi second. Your duty is to the Republic and your men. The Jedi's creed is a very distant third. Obi-Wan opened his mouth to say something, but I didn't give him the chance to speak. I slammed a Force-enhanced fist at the table, denting it. Tell me, how many Twi'lek died because you two were playing games? If Skywalker had not followed your example, he might have been able to deal with the Confederate resistance on the ground. I wouldn't have been forced to call in an orbital strike to clear the last crippling cluster of proton cannons, I hissed. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The turmoil that Kenobi was radiating was obvious to anyone with the senses to pick it up. This is war. Not a police action or a run-of-the-mill peacekeeping. When you mess around, more people die. The longer any single battle or the conflict as a whole lasts, the casualties became greater. For both sides, not to mention the civilians caught in between. Obi-Wan, if you and the rest of the Jedi can't move from the mindset of a peacekeepers to that of a generals, you will get more people killed. Either directly by criffing up as you and Anakin did today, and causing the deaths of your men when you criffed up by the numbers. Or indirectly, like you did by forcing me to sacrifice the civilians at Site Beta, so we could safely land our main force and proceed with liberating Ryloth. As we speak, more people are dying in the Sis camps. I shook my head. Sometimes people either under your direct command or civilians must be sacrificed so more people can be saved. That goes contrary to everything we are taught as Jedi. To everything we are, exclaimed Obi-Wan. Then you have a decision to make, General Kenobi, I stated in a carefully bland voice. You will either become the leader of men I know you can be, an officer that will be the pride of the Republic's armed forces. A general who does right by his oath and brings as many of his men home alive as possible. Or you will get out of the GAR. That is a choice all Jedi will have to make, sooner than later. We can't afford any more such victories. I pointed at the deck, and Ryloth's soil below it. My comm beeped, breaking the moment. I bit off a curse and activated it. I'm listening. Sir, we have holocall from Coruscant. It's the Chancellor and General Valentra. Patch it to Conference Room 3A. I ordered. The holoprojector around which the round table dominating the room was built, came to life, showing the blue-tinted images of Palpatine, Valentra, Yularen, Yoda and that of Ryloth's senator. He was the same man I had ordered arrested for trying to release Grievous under Palpatine's instructions during the hostage crisis on Coruscant. He got away, but not without suffering a serious blow to his power. That man wasn't one of my greatest fans, but so far he's been unable to stir up too much trouble. Ask General Vale. What is your progress? Exclaimed Palpatine. He appeared pleased to see me in one piece. Which, considering who and what he was, meant nothing. We hold Ryloth's orbit and have annihilated the Separatist fleet blockading the planet. 1 droid command ship, 2 battleships and 40 munificents were destroyed by our forces as well as 12,000 Vulture fighters. However, we suffered heavy casualties in order to achieve such a feat. Excellent work, General. Palpatine smiled at me. It wasn't reassuring in the least. What is the situation on the ground? Asked Valentra. Our forces are disembarking and we'll proceed with the liberation of Ryloth as soon as that is done, I stated with a blank expression. However, there are some grim news you all should be aware of. I proceeded to inform them about the slaves we saved in orbit in the camp set up by the Sis. Ryloth's senator started screaming for immediate action and I could see that Palpi was going to order it. You have to save those people, General. Consider this an order, snapped Palpatine, faking a look of horror. The fastest way to finish this campaign will be to capture the capital where Wat Tambor has his command center, I said, calling up a projection of the said city. It was built in on a solid rock spire, surrounded by a kilometers-deep abyss. A siege could go on for months, Palpatine stated the obvious. It was probably what he was hoping for. That would mean that I'll be stuck here for that long. Too bad, that I had other plans to deal with it. My people have suffered greatly. Such a siege will be too much, grumbled the senator. Plan, have you, General Vale? Asked Yoda. While the capital is our primary target, we need to dispatch strong forces to liberate the camps. From a single battalion, up to an entire regiment will be needed depending on how powerful the garrisons are. Once I have sufficient men near the major camps, we'll attack them at the same time. Because of that, I won't have enough free troops to assault the city while liberating the Sis-held population. I intend to ask for help. It appears that despite their vicious attempts to suppress the resistance of the locals, the Sis has been unsuccessful. Cham Syndulla leads the largest contingent of resistance fighters. I'll do my best to procure his assistance. He has the reputation of an extremist. The Chancellor gave me a grandfatherly smile which would have made Dumbledore proud. He can be unpredictable. I don't trust him, shouted the senator. He is a power-hungry maniac. I'll leave Ryloth's politics in your capable hands, Senator. As per your orders, Chancellor, I'll do everything in my power to help the local population. And why we are not sending additional reinforcements? Asked Palpatine. We are stretched to the limit, sir. General Valentra joined the conversation. There is no one else to send. It was extremely fortunate that a squadron of Venotas with escorts were already on the way, which would do a lot to shore up our space defenses. I didn't relish the possibility of the Sis sending in another fleet and blowing me out of orbit. It's unlikely that we would be able to achieve a timely victory without Syndulla, I stated with a grim expression on my face. Something to add, have you, Master Kenobi? Asked Yoda. Obi-Wan shook his head. No, Master Yoda. Very well. Liberate Ryloth, General Vale. Ordered Palpatine before cutting the connection. It was time to stretch my orders to their limits. Obi-Wan, if you decide to stay with us, I have a job for you.